Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to those of you in Australia. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, and myself. And thank you and welcome back to Ambassador Dennis Ross and to tonight's wonderful moderator, Patt Morrison. We really appreciate both of you being with us to try to keep us as up to date as possible on these critical current events, especially those in the Middle East. I sent a note recently. The best information is that President Biden is not speaking till well after our program ends tonight. So you don't have to be nervous about missing that. And you can watch both tonight. You can be updated about the Middle East and hear the latest words from the Democratic National Convention. Reminder that this week, once again, we are hosting two programs in addition to tonight's. On Wednesday, we will host the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, who will be in conversation with Warren Only on the topic, A World at War, Is There a Chance for Peace? Next week on Monday, we will host the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has covered the U.S. Supreme Court for more than 3 decades, currently a law professor at Yale Law School, Linda Greenhouse, who will discuss a Supreme Court on the edge, and that will be with the wonderful Patt Morrison. Again, we have a week of Pat. And on Wednesday, the former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, will discuss an expert's view on our world in chaos. So we have 2 great programs next week as well, both of which will be moderated by Patt Morrison. After Labor Day, we have 2 programs again that week, but we have them unusually so on Wednesday and Thursday. September 4th, Wednesday with Max Boot, who's going to talk about Reagan's GOP to Trump's MAGA, what will come next. And then that Thursday on September 5th, we will host 2 Stanford professors, Larry Diamond and his colleague, who will be discussing the new Stanford anti-Semitism report about anti-Jewish sentiment and practices on college campuses. Reminder, all of our programs are available via podcast and via our YouTube channel, and the links to all of those access points are in every email we send, so you can always find them, and if all else fails, email me and I will respond, as you well know. So use all of our links, especially as the November election nears. Be sure to send your friends our email so they can also register. Now, to introduce tonight's guest and our moderator, please welcome my colleague and friend and leadership partner in this America at a Crossroads series, former Congressman Mel Levine. Mel?
Thanks very much, Janice. It's a great pleasure for me to once again introduce my long-term friend, Dennis Ross, to this hour. Dennis needs no introduction to our audience, in as much as I think this is the 7th time that he's been gracious enough to speak with us to talk about the complex issues in the context of the Israel-Gaza war. So I will be brief. Dennis has served with distinction in the administrations of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, and he has also had a long career at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He has worked on Middle East peace issues for decades. No one has a greater depth of knowledge and years of experience in American efforts, of which he's been in the center, to secure peace agreements between the U.S. and the Palestinians, not to mention between the U.S. and other countries in the region. He has found time to, somehow or other, he has found time in addition to that, to write 6 books on Middle East peace efforts, including his comprehensive book, The Missing Piece. As Janice indicated, we are very fortunate that the great Patt Morrison will be our moderator. Pat also needs no introduction to this audience. She is a longtime LA Times writer and public radio superstar, for which she has numerous awards, including last year as the Society of Professional Journalists Creators in the Los Angeles chapter, honoring Pat with its Distinguished Journalist Award. Pat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you to everyone for watching. We are bringing you these critical programs about what's going on in the Middle East, in addition to what's going on in our election. So it's a very vital period in our history, in the world's history, Thank you for joining us and for watching. And of course, to Ambassador Ross, welcome back.
Good to be with you, as always.
There is news today. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that Israel has accepted a proposal to bridge differences that are holding up a ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza. And he called on Hamas to do the same without saying whether the concerns cited by Hamas have been addressed and offering no details. I want to paraphrase Churchill, maybe to say this is not the beginning of the end, but maybe it's beyond the end of the beginning.
I have to say, we've been down this road before. There have been times when there's been a lot of optimism. There has not been a hostage deal since November. So we're looking at, 9 months since November. I would say there is a possibility now, but I want to put this in some perspective for you. There was a basic framework that was established back in February. The key at that time was that there were going to be 3 phases of a hostage release. There was going to be a 6-week period for each phase. The first phase was going to provide for a release of hostages, and it was going to be potentially linked to a second phase that would be focused on negotiating a permanent ceasefire. That framework basically became undone when Hamas reversed its previous position. When that framework was established and was agreed, Hamas accepted the fact that you could begin this process of 3 phases without first having a commitment to a permanent ceasefire. They changed that position in April and May. Israel, towards the end of May, came up with a proposal out of its war cabinet when Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz were still a part of the war cabinet, in which Israel, for the first time, actually created more of an explicit link between the first phase and the second phase. That was significant because it basically meant you wouldn't just have the first phase and that would be the end of it. This was a way for Israel to at least signal, okay, we're at least prepared to seriously discuss a permanent ceasefire, and we're prepared to link what's happening in the second phase to the first phase. The idea was that on day 16 of the first phase, you would begin to discuss, you would begin to negotiate the terms for a permanent ceasefire. Even if you didn't reach an agreement by the end of the first phase, you would continue the existing ceasefire so long as the negotiations on trying to reach that permanent ceasefire were underway. So at the end of May, it looked like, and this is what led to President Biden on May 31, announcing that we saw this proposal that the Israelis had made as being a basis on which to not only produce the 3 phases, produce the hostage deal, but also to create, in his words, a pathway to a permanent ceasefire. That speech was then taken by the administration to the Security Council, and it endorsed the framework that he laid out in that speech. Okay, so that was the end of May. Here we are in August. Now, what has happened since that time? What created a sense of return to a possibility was that Hamas in early July, agreed they would go back to the idea of not requiring a commitment by Israel in advance before you could start the phases to a permanent ceasefire. That looked to be an indication that we are now in a position where we actually could resolve this framework. Now, Bibi Netanyahu, at a certain point in July, came back and didn't change the framework, but he upped the ante, I would say, on 3 issues. One issue was on the issue of Rafah and the Philadelphia corridor. This is the border between Egypt and Gaza. A second issue was what's known as the Netzarim corridor. And this is kind of the corridor where the Israelis have established a military position that divides the northern part of Gaza from the southern part of Gaza. And suddenly the prime minister wanted to have a mechanism to prevent armed Hamas from going back to the north. And the third issue was on those Hamas prisoners who would be released, those who had the most blood on their hands. Israel wanted the right to be able to veto specific individuals. Now, Hamas basically said that wasn't what was part of the framework before. You're changing the terms. When you hear the term bridging proposal, It's the US coming in with a bridging proposal to resolve the differences as it related to those three issues. Today, what Secretary of State Blinken said after he had a 3-hour meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, what he said was, Prime Minister Netanyahu has accepted the American bridging proposal. And he said, therefore, the onus, he didn't put it quite that way, he said it's up to Hamas now to also accept the bridging proposal. Now, Hamas had said before he came out, they've rejected what's going on because they think this is a bridging proposal that tilts too much towards the Israelis. We'll see what their position is. Some of what I think was going on was some negotiating, but I think there's another issue that we have to keep in mind as it relates to Yahya Sinwar and whether or not he really wants to deal right now.
Well, we'll get to the circumstances of his getting his new job in a while, but he may have something that he has to prove as well in this position that he occupies. But it sounds as though, at least from Hamas' point of view, as you said, it sounds to them that Netanyahu was changing some of the terms, and Blinken goes in there trying to make these terms acceptable to both sides. So does that mean that we are no farther along and maybe even farther back than we were in February and March?
No, I don't think we are, because I do think the fundamental premise that has been accepted is that you will not require a commitment to a permanent ceasefire before you launch the process. Once that was removed, once you got back to where you were in February, then you had a framework. Now the question becomes, on some of these key issues that relate to how you're going to implement and how you're going to carry it out, those three issues that I raised, that basically Netanyahu, in his mind, was clarifying what he wanted. In Hamas's mind, he was in effect changing the terms. This bridging proposal is not what Blinken blocked today. It's a bridging proposal that the US, the Egyptians, and the Qataris, after 2 days of discussions at the end of last week, it's the bridging proposal that they then gave to each side. Now, that's what Hamas said they didn't like. Blinken came in today, and in the 3 hours, he basically got an agreement from Netanyahu that he would accept the bridging proposal. So we'll have to see, are we seeing Hamas simply trying to negotiate right now? Are we seeing an effort to sort of alter those terms? We'll have to see what, in fact, Secretary Blinken discovers. He's going to see President Sisi tomorrow, and then he'll go on to Qatar. After that, where he'll see the Emir of Qatar. They are dealing with Hamas. There is Halil Yahya is a deputy to Yahya Sinwar, and he's been in Doha. So he is someone who has a connection to Sinwar, although being able to deal and communicate with Sinwar is not so easy. It's not instantaneous. Sometimes it takes several days. So we don't really know at this point exactly where Hamas is. As I said, I think we're seeing more posturing on their part, maybe the same way that Netanyahu was posturing. When he was, Netanyahu even today, when after he said he agreed that he had accepted the bridging proposal, but he also said, we're not leaving the Philadelphia corridor. So is that in the bridging proposal? Is he posturing? Both sides, as we've seen over the last several months, have postured in a way that's designed, at least in Bibi's case, to address the right of his coalition. And in Sinwar's case, maybe just the way he thinks that you build greater pressure on the Israelis, especially when there's increasing concern about the survivability of the remaining hostages who are alive.
Today, Reuters has just this evening quoted a Hamas senior official criticizing Blinken's statement, saying the proposal raises many ambiguities because it's not what was presented to us nor agreed upon. He said that Hamas has already confirmed to mediators that, quote, we don't need new Gaza ceasefire negotiations. We need to agree on an implementation mechanism. Is there any room in that language for anything to happen?
As someone who's negotiated for a long time, a lot of things are said in public. They don't always match what's said in private. What's said in public is designed to deal with multiple audiences. You're, in a sense, your adversary, the mediators, your own public. So there's a lot of different audiences that what you say in public are designed to address. Now, it's fair to point out, the more you say things in public that tie your hands, it makes it harder to make concessions, because then it demonstrates you're the one who backed down. So it's not that these public statements are irrelevant, but I wouldn't say they necessarily are the sum total of the reality today.
Does Netanyahu now have a domestic selling point to say to people who are protesting his decisions and his way of handling this? Look, I've done all I can on my part to get the hostages free, and now it's all up to Hamas. Or is it too late for him to make that argument?
Well, certainly, he is making that argument. The question you're really asking is not whether he's going to make the argument, but whether it's credible to the people who are most concerned. I think for the hostage families, they remain quite uneasy and are not convinced, because from their standpoint, they believe that if he doesn't commit to just sort of saying, okay, we're gonna end this, they feel, look, do that and you get the hostages back. And by the way, many people within the IDF itself, within the upper reaches of the IDF, maybe even the defense minister, also feel, just get a deal done. If Hamas doesn't live up to it, we can easily go back in. But the longer it takes for you to go ahead and get a deal done, the fewer the remaining hostages we're going to recover alive. You cannot talk about total victory if we don't get the remaining hostages back alive. Then you will have had a betrayal twice. The government of Israel has a fundamental compact with its public. And that compact is, not only will we protect you, but basically we never leave anybody in the field. Bibi Netanyahu, when he did the Gilad Shalit deal in 2011, traded 1,026 Palestinian prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar, to get back one soldier, reflecting that ethos. We never leave anybody behind. Well, right now you have 119 hostages. You know, the best guess is probably around 60 remain alive. So already you're leaving a number in the field, even if you're gonna get you'll get their bodies back. That's another failure. You failed them on October 7th. You shouldn't fail them a second time. That is also a fundamental sentiment, not only of much of the Israeli public, but absolutely of the upper reaches of the Israeli military. So I think that it certainly helps Netanyahu to have the Secretary of State say, we've made a bridging proposal and he's accepted it, and the onus is now on Hamas. It certainly gives Netanyahu an argument and a talking point. It will not convince everybody, because the longer this goes on, the fewer surviving hostages we're gonna end up seeing.
We'll be getting a lot of questions. Get to your questions in about 20 minutes or so. Many of them coming in. Put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as we can, starting, well, I guess in about 10 or 15 minutes or so. Ambassador Ross, how much of this is simply theater if anyone takes the viewpoint that real peace is not in Netanyahu's interests or in Sinwar's interests?
Look, the fact that you have a lot of Israelis who have died, the fact that you still have hostages, and we know that in the last week, several were killed. The fact that you have, the number may not be precise, but you're talking about tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been killed. This is not theater. Theater is basically performance. We're seeing fundamental
the talks and the discussions rather than.
No, I know, but I'm saying it's the people who are engaging in theater. There's real lives that are in jeopardy. There's real suffering that is the result. The longer you drag this out, I don't think that Sinwar and Netanyahu are solely performing, but I think each of them has an agenda. Bibi's agenda is he wants to be able to declare that Israel succeeded. It achieved total victory. Is one thing that is noteworthy. I've said when I was on the show with you before, I said total victory is a slogan, it's not an objective. Now, when Netanyahu spoke to the Congress, it was the first time I heard him define total victory. He said total victory, and he then said it means dismantling Hamas's military capability, and Hamas can no longer be in control of Gaza. Now, the truth is, Israel's not that far from being able to achieve those two objectives. The question is he prepared to define success as that, provided the hostages come out, even if there's still going to be thousands of Hamas with arms, even if the Hamas may not be in control of Gaza, but Hamas will still be a factor in Gaza, not a military factor, but they're still a militia, but a political factor. Part of Netanyahu's concern is he doesn't want the Palestinian Authority to replace Hamas. So his declaration of victory has to be Hamas isn't coming back in control, and there's going to be a kind of third force, or we'll have an Arab interim transitional administration. The problem he faces is that the Arabs won't come in unless the Palestinian Authority asks them. And he doesn't want to have the Palestinian Authority in a visible position because both his ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, reject that. The issue for him all along has been, can he do a deal that preserves his government? The reason there are many people who think he's not that interested in doing a deal because they think he wants to preserve his government over and above every other objective. What we're seeing right now, we know that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have already referred to the prospective deal as a surrender deal. So can he square this circle? My sense is he's under increasing pressure in a way where it's harder and harder not to make a choice. So we'll see in his case. In Sinwar's case, here's what concerns me right now. The Iranians and Hezbollah have both said, and they put it out, initially it was just reports, but their officials are saying this explicitly, openly. They will not respond and carry out the attacks they've said they would in response to the Israeli killing of Fuad Shakur in Beirut, and even though the Israelis haven't acknowledged it, the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. And they're saying they won't do it if there's going to be a ceasefire. Now, Sinwar, from the very beginning, hoped that what he was doing on October 7th was going to trigger a regional war. His expectation was that the Iranians would go to war to back up what they were doing, Hezbollah would do it, the West Bank would erupt, all the other Shia militias would do it, the Israeli Arabs would rise up, and he really saw this as kind of a death knell, the beginning of the end for Israel. So here, the Iranians and Hezbollah are saying that we're not going to carry out an attack if there's a ceasefire. So does that mean that he has an incentive not to have a deal right now? Because if there's no ceasefire, Iran and Hezbollah will carry out strikes against Israel, and Israel's already made it clear, basically, they're prepared to retaliate if that's the case. I think it's an open question. There are some in Israel, especially in the IDF, who believe that he's under increasing pressure. And in part, he's under increasing pressure, not simply because of what Israel is doing in terms of cleaning out the military infrastructure now in Gaza, above and beyond what we saw before, but also because the people who he was closest to, Marwan Issa, and most importantly, Mohammed Deif. Mohammed Deif was a legend within Hamas. He was the founder of the Izzedim al-Qassam Brigades, the military wing of Hamas, which is what Sinwar was the head of before he's now been appointed as also the head of the political bureau. He was a legend because he was the guy who was a mastermind of bombings in the 1990s. The Israelis, on 7 different occasions, tried to assassinate him. They failed on 7 occasions. He was a kind of spiritual guru to Sinwar. He was an architect of the operations. And the Israelis did succeed in killing him about a month ago. So Marwan Issa was number 3. Mohammed Deif, who was really kind of a co-leader of the Izzedim al-Qassam brigades, they're both gone. And he's increasingly alone. And according to Israeli intelligence, more and more of the Izzedim al-Qassam brigade commanders have either been killed or the Israelis have captured them. And many of those within the brigades are now saying, look, we need a respite. So their argument is that he actually does have a deal. He does have an interest in a deal. I've been asked about this, and I'll tell you my honest position is I don't know. I'm not sure. The fact that what you were describing potentially as theater before with Sinwar, maybe it's theater, maybe it's posturing, or maybe what he's saying is he really doesn't want to deal right now. I think we're going to discover this fairly soon.
Ambassador, you wrote a while back about Biden's Middle East moonshot in Foreign Affairs. A Saudi deal would be a game changer. That Biden has one priority: to end the war in Gaza and restore American peacemaking leverage in the Middle East. So does Biden change any of his plans? Does he alter any of his rules or the mechanics of the relationship with Israel to try to achieve this without being seen as abandoning Israel or losing ground with American authority, such as it is in the Mideast?
I do think that there is increased leverage on Prime Minister Netanyahu, because I think he understands you have President Biden, who had 2 weeks ago a very difficult phone call with Netanyahu, where he basically said, don't play me. Don't take the US for granted. He had committed to the president when he met him in the Oval Office when he was here, at the time that he gave his speech to the Congress, that he wanted to do the deal. And then the president saw him upping the ante on those 3 issues I mentioned. And he said, don't play me. And one thing about Biden has a deep emotional attachment to Israel, but Biden is also the kind of guy that if he feels you're not being straight with him, you have a problem with him. I think the fact that Secretary Blinken had 3 hours today with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that at the end of it, he accepted the bridging proposal. I'm quite certain that the bridging proposals weren't exactly what Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted, but I suspect he feels that the president is very serious, and in an ironic way, precisely because he's not running, he's a little freer to do things, to say things, and to do things that he might not have been willing to say if he was running for re-election. And I suspect that Bibi also knows that. I also believe it's very much in Israel's interest, and it's very much in Netanyahu's interest that he needs to do a deal while Biden's still there. First, on the Saudi issue, if you do a deal, if it's possible to do a deal on the Saudis in which the US is going to take a defense treaty to the Congress, to the Senate, it isn't possible to get that adopted if Trump is president. It would be possible if Harris is. The Democrats, given their attitudes towards Saudi Arabia and given their attitudes towards Trump, you're not going to get 67 votes in the Senate to adopt a treaty. So if Bibi wants normalization with Saudi Arabia requires a defense treaty for that. They also require something on the Palestinians. So Bibi's going to have to make a decision there I can describe what I think is necessary, but it's going to have to be a credible pathway towards a Palestinian state. But he needs to do it if he wants that on the one hand. And I would say on the other, I think Vice President Harris, I think she's a supporter of Israel, but she doesn't have the same attachment that Biden has. And Trump is completely unpredictable. And Netanyahu knows that. And so I think, if you don't do the deal with Biden, you're going to be in a position where you're going to be, I think, less well off than you certainly could be.
Before we get to everyone's questions, and a lot of them are about domestic politics right now and the relationship with what's going on in the Mideast, there was the assassination of the Hamas political leader in Tehran. It embarrassed, it humiliated Iran, because this was its secure quarters for visiting dignitaries. And evidently a bomb had been planted there some months ago, anticipating the visit of Hania. And yet Israel has not claimed responsibility wisely, and Iran has not responded with some immediate show of force or aggression that some people might have expected. What is the dynamic there? What's going on?
Well, I think you described it well. You're right. Israel has not acknowledged it, even though everybody in the world seems to attribute it to Israel, and the Iranians immediately blamed Israel. But by not acknowledging it, at least it creates a little bit of space for the Iranians in terms of not retaliating. The other thing that creates a little bit of space for the Iranians in terms of not retaliating is there were no Iranians who were killed. This was, as you described, quite probably a bomb was planted. It is interesting that the Iranians themselves put out different versions of this. They're putting out a version that it was a drone attack. I think the reason is the where Hania was in the Revolutionary Guard guest house. The Revolutionary Guard, because of all the visitors for the inauguration of the new Iranian president, they told Hania that they didn't want him staying where sometimes he does stay. They preferred this because it was easier to provide security. And so to admit that a bomb was placed in their own guest house is pretty difficult for them to do. So they've actually tried to put out a different version of what happened. But the fact that 2 people were killed, the only destruction was in the room where he was staying, and the only other person who died was his bodyguard, tends to lend credence to the idea that this was a bomb. But anyway, I think the key point, which you touched on, for the Iranians, this is not just an embarrassment, it's a humiliation. You know, an honored guest, one of the leading members of the axis of resistance, and you can't protect them in Tehran. The message it sends, if you don't do something about it, even to your own proxies, is a message of weakness that the Iranian regime will not want to send. Now, on the other hand, you have a new president, and there are fairly credible reports, given where they're emerging, that he went to the supreme leader and asked him not to retaliate, because he said, and some of this is a function of messages we have been sending on our own and through others, that the consequences for Iran, especially economically, if they retaliate and this turns into a war, could be quite devastating. And here you have a new president who is trying to, he wants to reach out to the West, he wants to end sanctions, he wants to try to deal with the economic woes they have, very high inflation, and great dissatisfaction of the Iranian public. And he wants to try to address that. So he apparently made an appeal to the supreme leader. There are reports now.
He doesn't want to dial it up to 11 right away.
He does not.
Okay.
The new president, Pezeshkian, seems to not want to have a retaliation at all. The supreme leader is still suggesting that Iran will do something. But when you say do something, you know, there was one point when they killed Israeli tourists in Bulgaria. So the doing something could fit different kinds of responses.
Well, let me ask you about one of those as we move toward domestic politics, which is today the intelligence community said that Iran was to blame for hacking Trump's presidential campaign and its emails. I don't know what you think about what Iran may have gotten out of it, other than to say, hey, look what we could do, because there has been, as far as I can tell, nobody's been publishing whatever it is that Iran got hold of.
Yeah.
So was this part of this, or was this some kind of separate ongoing operation already?
I suspect it was something separate, ongoing operation. You know, it's not the equivalent of what we saw in 2016, when WikiLeaks basically got from the Russians all of the Democratic Party, you know, the Democratic National Committees, all of its internal emails, and then put them out. It was clearly designed to damage Hillary Clinton and the Democratic campaign at the time. What the Iranians may have been doing was maybe trying to acquire some material that maybe they could use later. But I suspect they do a lot of hacking, and they try to penetrate a lot of emails in this country. And so that's probably an ongoing separate operation that they have.
Let's go to some questions. And I know there are a lot of questions about what's going on. Of course, the Democratic National Convention now, questions about the protests that have been going on that are pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza, a lot of protests over what's happening with civilians in Gaza. bombings that are meant to target Hamas that also end
Yeah.
up having the phrase collateral damage, and the fact that Kamala Harris has spoken about that, about her concerns about that. So as I look for more questions, maybe you can speak to that.
Look, I think it's hard not to respond to the level of death and destruction in Gaza. And while it's true, you can say that Hamas is responsible for it, it doesn't change the fact that the level of destruction, the casualties, the fatalities, the injuries, they're terrible. You know, you can't be you can't deny it, you can't be indifferent to it. I wish that Hamas cared a little bit about its own public, because if it did, you know, this is actually something Tony Blinken said today, they would be the ones who would have an interest in a ceasefire. They would have an interest, they would be the ones who would have an interest in getting a pause right now. And that's obviously not the case. But, you know, we're looking at the problem with the humanitarian assistance going into Gaza today is the amounts are probably enough, but Hamas diverts them, armed gangs divert them. So there's no security for the distribution of humanitarian assistance. One of the things that the administration would like to do, if it gets the deal, is to basically set up a structure not only to ensure that humanitarian assistance is coming in the necessary amounts, but also that it goes to those who need it. The administration is working with the Israelis to be sure, for example, that enough vaccine for polio is going in, because you now have had a breakout of some cases of polio. Look, one of the factors that also affects the Israelis, you know, when diseases basically begin to emerge in Gaza, it's not like you can hermetically seal Israel. You know, these diseases don't respect borders. So there's an Israeli interest as well in making sure that cholera outbreaks don't take place, that there isn't a polio outbreak. The Israelis have been permitting large amounts of vaccines to go into Gaza now, and the administration is working with them to ensure that you can get a couple million vaccines available to inoculate people.
EA in Santa Paula, it's kind of a two-part question. She asks about the policies that Vice President Harris has to pursue when she's got 30 uncommitted pro-Palestinian delegates, but beyond the convention, to assuage the anger and fear of both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian factions in this country, which has been one of her appeals for younger people to turn out, is that she seems to have lent an ear to the problems, the concerns of people in Gaza.
You know, I would say that it seemed for a while that she was sort of the designated person within the administration to be the spokesperson for addressing in the most, I would say, vocal way the death and destruction in Gaza, our concerns for it, the need to address the humanitarian requirements of the people in Gaza. That clearly seemed to be her role. That I think she took it on with some relish. And I think it reflected a genuine concern on her part. So, you know, I would say that is a priority for her. I think it's understandable that it's a priority. It doesn't have the same accent maybe that the president has talked about it, but not with the same degree of visibility that she has.
The question that many have asked too about how Harris' support, if she were to be elected for Israel, would manifest itself different from Biden and different from Trump.
I think in her case, she's likely to be more sensitive to some of the other international pressures. You know, I think she has had, I think, some forays internationally, and I think she's more aware of where a lot of the allies are vis-a-vis the Israelis. You know, one of the interesting things would be if we judge her in terms of this Israeli government, or you judge her in terms of a new Israeli government. It's one thing, even we're seeing President Biden himself become less patient, more frustrated, and I think prepared to put more leverage on the current Israeli government, the current prime minister. If you have a new, I think we're going to see within a year a different Israeli government. So if you have a President Harris come in, I suspect that she will cut that new government some slack and give them a chance. I suspect she would give less slack to the current Israeli government.
Both Tom in New York and Eric in Los Angeles asked about the significance of the tunnels that are being used by Gaza from Egypt, the question of bringing fighters back to North Gaza, and plans, Sinwar's plans to use the Chinese efforts to combine Hamas with the Palestinian Authority to take over Gaza. I mean, are these scenarios that are so far down the road that it's nothing that can be addressed now, or is there something of substance to this that should be addressed now to forestall it?
Yeah, I would, let me take the tunnels first, and then I want to deal with the issue of Hamas and the PA. The Israelis are making a lot of headway right now in terms of dismantling the entire military infrastructure. When I talk about the entire military infrastructure, what I mean is the weapons depots, the weapons labs, the weapons production facilities. They are dismantling increasing amounts of that infrastructure. I would even say that they have probably dismantled about 50% of the tunnel complex, which is significant given how much it took to be able to develop that. One of the things that is a focal point for the Israelis, and I would say for us as well, is that Hamas cannot be permitted to reconstitute itself. When Prime Minister Netanyahu raises the Egyptian-Gaza border, it's a legitimate issue because basically Hamas got whatever it needed through that border, above ground and below ground. So there has to be a mechanism that guarantees that you're cutting that off, that can no longer be, in a sense, replenished with a lot of material. You know, if you're going to succeed in ending this and ensure that Hamas can't make a comeback, that's absolutely critical. And I do think it's part of what we have been focused on, meaning the administration has been focused on. On the issue of Hamas and the PA, by my count, there have been 13 different reconciliation agreements between them. 13. Not one has been implemented. So, when the Chinese a couple of weeks ago hosted a meeting and they announced there was an agreement, I said, great, this is the 13th agreement that will not be implemented. It is not an accident that Hamas and the PA aren't able to reconcile. They represent two fundamentally different identities. The PA is basically a secular national organization. Hamas is an Islamist organization. They have a very different image for what the Palestinian identity should be. The inability to reconcile is not an accident. Now, what I think the administration is trying to do is to deal with, if you bring an end to the war, someone has to manage Gaza. In the near term, there is no Palestinian entity that can do it. The PA itself is too dysfunctional in the West Bank, too weak, too corrupt. And it also doesn't, even if the Israelis were prepared to permit it, they don't want to come in on the backs of Israeli tanks. That's not the way for them to reestablish any credibility or legitimacy. They need to reform themselves before they can play a serious role in Gaza. Hamas is going to be out of the governance area, but you need something. Now, what the administration has been working on is an interim administration that would involve the UAE, the Egyptians, maybe the Moroccans, and 50,000 Palestinians who currently are part of a functional structure. These were people who managed day-to-day issues under the Palestinian Authority when it was there. They stayed managing those issues under Hamas after the Hamas coup. They're not political, they're functional. So you would have this kind of a structure that has regional representation, maybe some international actors as well, Palestinians who are in Gaza, maybe Palestinians from the diaspora who could play a role in what might be this kind of international council. This transition would be designed to be a transition to the Palestinian Authority. This is something that Netanyahu is still resisting because he wants to say the Palestinian Authority is not coming back into Gaza. But the reality is there isn't an alternative to it. And the reality also is you need a bridge to the future. And this bridge to the future can come from the Arabs, from Palestinians who are there, from some diaspora Palestinians, and from a reform PA. So in 12 to 18 months, you have the PA that comes back in. You're not going to get the UAE to come in. You're not going to get the Egyptians to come in unless they can see there's a pathway to the future, because neither one wants to be stuck in Gaza.
Now, let me ask, and there are several versions of this question. I will ask Michael's. This is about internal obstacles to some kind of peace. Michael says he's interested in what you think about the actions of the settlers in the West Bank. He says it's difficult to support the Israeli government when it allows or even encourages settlers to attack the inhabitants with impunity.
Well, he's right. It's outrageous. Israel is a country that is ruled by law. These are completely lawless acts. What happened is a few days ago, every single leader even in this Israeli government condemned this. The leaders of the settler movement condemned it. This was the only way to describe this was a pogrom. The settler movement said these were young Israelis, what are known as the hilltop Israelis, who were not even settlers, who came in from the outside. And they carried out a pogrom. That's exactly what they did. Now, it's one thing to condemn it. It's something else to stop it. And it's something else to make sure that those who did it pay a price for having done it. If you're going to convince Palestinians that they're not at the mercy, without any protection from Israelis, from the IDF, the only way you're going to convince them is if you see that those who did this pay a price for having done it. And you have to see a more active role of the IDF in terms of preventing this. The former head of Central Command, a guy named General Fox, he retired on July 8th. He was constantly working to prevent these kinds of acts. And his successor, from my understanding, is committed to doing the same thing, but they were caught unaware. They were caught up by surprise by this. Now, part of the problem is that you have the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who basically tends to protect these kinds of groups. And until you also see, the IDF acting, the IDF frequently turns over those that they will arrest because they don't have the power to arrest and put in jail. So they have to give them to the police, and frequently Ben-Gvir releases them. So that has to stop. And the prime minister, if he allows that to go on, then he's not living up to ensuring that Israel is a country that is ruled by law.
We have a question from Ruben, and I'll proceed it by pointing out that the news was just out again today that humanitarian workers, the bulk of the deaths of humanitarian workers around the world this year have been in Gaza as a consequence of the work there. And Ruben says, why is it that Arab countries won't come forward to offer non-combatant Gaza residents a temporary refuge until Gaza can be reconstructed under a new government? Because every day we hear of an oops sort of attack. Well, we may have gotten Hamas warriors, but what is the ratio of women, children, non-combatants, deaths and injuries to those Hamas deaths, the warrior deaths that are being scored by Israel? So what dynamic can be at work here in the midst of war?
There's really sort of two different questions that you're posing. One question relates to the number of deaths. The Israeli military says that they have killed 17,000 Hamas operatives, meaning from the top to to basically the fighters. Now the Ministry of Health, which is Hamas run in Gaza, says that the total number is over 40,000 now. If that number is accurate, if the Israeli number is accurate, and I think no one knows for sure what these numbers are, but let's take these as a possible measure, then it means nearly half, more than half of the fatalities are non-combatants. So it means you have a lot of suffering from people who are not responsible for this conflict. It's the tragedy, and and when you look at it, you have to treat it as a tragedy, and we should have a collective responsibility trying to minimize it and to address the consequences of it. Now, I think the other question related to the Arab states and why they don't allow a kind of temporary refuge, some of this is caught up with what I will call the narrative of the conflict. The Palestinians and some in the Arab world say Israel is trying to end the conflict by exporting the Palestinians, by expelling the Palestinians. And so if Arab states are seen as allowing Palestinians to come in, even on a quote temporary basis, the fear is that temporary will turn into permanence, and that also they will be a handmaiden to fulfilling this narrative that this is the way the Israelis are trying to resolve the conflict. Now, the truth is, someone should have taken on the narrative. They should have said, no, that's untrue. And we will take some on a temporary basis. I mean, think about the fact, one of the things that has made Gaza, this gets to your heart of the question about the dynamic. One of the things that has made Gaza different than almost every other conflict, including in the Middle East. If you look at Mosul, the US flattened Mosul. We literally flattened it. The destruction of Mosul is worse than you see in Gaza. And we did it. But the people of Mosul could leave. The people in Gaza can't leave. You look in Syria, where, again, you have 5.5 million people who left Syria. But the people in Gaza can't leave. Had this been treated like any other conflict, not only in the Middle East, but around the world, where people can leave to get away from the war. You know, I'm often asked, one of the courses I teach is sort of the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I spend a lot of time dealing in 1948, because there's different narratives about the refugee issue. What was the cause of the refugee issue? Well, how did it evolve? And, in 1948, a lot of Palestinians left because it was a war. Who stays in the middle of a war? People leave. It's common sense. But in this particular conflict, the Palestinians who were there were not allowed to do two things. One, they weren't allowed to go into the 300 miles of tunnels that Hamas built, which could have saved a lot of the Palestinians in Gaza who've been killed, but they weren't allowed to do that. And two, they weren't allowed to leave.
Sandra has a question that I've seen before. Why there aren't protesters at Trump rallies against his support of Israel and in favor of some kind of peace arrangement, certainly looking out for, as you just pointed out, the refugees or would-be refugees in Gaza? It says his support of Israel doesn't seem to bother the potential pool of protesters.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? It's as if they think it's not even worth their time to go and protest there. They clearly have an expectation if they protest in other places against the Democrats, they'll be more likely to respond. They'll be more sensitive to it. I don't really have another explanation for that. Look, many of the protesters are completely sincere, but there clearly are those who are pro-Hamas. There is no justification for being pro-Hamas. What they have done to their own public, even beforehand, what their aims are. They have never been pro-peace. They have never been in favor of two states. There is no justification for demonstrating on behalf of Hamas. You want to demonstrate for Palestinians, I get it. You want to demonstrate for Hamas, not only do I not get it, but you reveal yourself for what you actually believe.
Marcia has a speculative question. Has Sinwar's cancer returned? Something called Israel Real Time just said so, that this may give him an impetus to work out a deal so he can get cancer treatment in Arab countries. Had you heard this before?
No. And I don't really have a reason to believe it's true.
We had another question I'm looking for who might have been answering it, wondering in a larger sense whether this is or will become Israel's Vietnam?
You know, it's a very, I think it's an important question, because Israel should not want to be stuck in Gaza in a war of attrition. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich want to expel the Palestinians from Gaza, want Israel to stay in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said repeatedly, Israel will not stay in Gaza, and it will not resettle Gaza. But the longer it takes to decide that Israel has achieved what it needed to achieve, the longer it stays there, the more it creates fresh recruits for Hamas. There is a lot of public opposition now in Gaza to Hamas, but there's a lot of anger too against the Israelis, and younger Palestinians in Gaza are not so hard to recruit right now for Hamas. And the longer you stay, it is true, the military capability has been dramatically weakened. Hamas, I've said this before, they're no longer a military, but the whole structure has broken down. And those, they can still carry out these sort of, they can plant these IEDs, they can do a few hit and run things, they're not incapable of a kind of insurgency. That's not what Israel should want. Israel can operate wherever it wants to in Gaza, but if it stays there, then it will gradually add to the recruits for Hamas on the one hand, and on the other hand, Israel will continue to lose soldiers in Gaza without being in a position where the threat from Gaza to Israel won't change. Today, Hamas cannot really pose a threat to Israel any longer. The key, as I said, is not to allow them to reconstitute.
And that's the paradox. The longer it goes on, the more opportunity there is to reconstitute.
I don't think it'll be so easy for them to reconstitute necessarily in terms of material coming in, but I do think that Israel will face an insurgency. The question was about Vietnam. You want to stay stuck in a place where basically you have a war of attrition. The strategic threat you face is not from Hamas. The strategic threat you face is Iran and Hezbollah. And if you remain stuck in Gaza, you're not dealing with the strategic threat that you face. One of the points that Secretary Blinken and President Biden, what I wrote about in the article you cited, if you do the Saudi deal, we saw on the night of April 13th that there was a regional coalition that intercepted 1/3 of everything that was fired against Israel. Never happened before in Israel's history. Now that demonstrates not only can Israel not necessarily do everything on its own, but it demonstrates you actually have partners to counter Iran and its proxies. You end the war here, you do the normalization deal with the Saudis, and you suddenly create a coalition of countries that are prepared to counter what the Iranians are doing with their proxies. That is fundamentally in Israel's strategic interests.
Ambassador, you've been with us before. You know we save the last minute, literally 60 seconds, to get something hopeful and positive from you.
So I know that, and I want to focus on what I just said. If there is going to be a deal, or even if there isn't a deal right now, but the Israelis can actually declare that they've succeeded, because I actually think they're not very far from it. And what needs to be done is to basically ensure that you cut off what can come into Gaza so that Hamas is not in a position to reconstitute itself. Then you are able to basically end the war and do the deal with the Saudis. That is a transformative event. It creates a real possibility and hope for the future. So it's not impossible. It looks, I describe it as a Rubik's Cube. That's what it is. To put all these pieces together requires the equivalent of doing a Rubik's Cube. But you know what? You can do Rubik's Cubes. This is possible. And because we're always supposed to end on an up note here, I want you to know that there is reason to be hopeful in the midst of everything that looks so gloomy.
We're so happy to hear it, and always happy to have you with us, Ambassador Dennis Ross. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You'll be seeing the upcoming programs on the screen in a moment, and we want to thank you for watching and for supporting America at a Crossroads at this vital time, unquestionably a crossroads crossroads in American history and in global history as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. I'm here with Linda Greenhouse next week.